Whatever food movement we have, people are actually having this conversation, right? Is there a food movement? Has to move away from identifying itself just as a matter of personal choice and shopping, and say we have a policy problem, we have a political problem. It's why we haven't made the progress we wanted to make. So that's kind of the first step, is admitting like there are political spaces where we need to be working on food, not just personal choice spaces. And we have a critique that balance hasn't been right. So there's law and policy, and then there's like complete lack of political will to use laws and policies that we already have. So we have some decent laws that could do things but don't get done because the agencies are afraid of the industry. The industry has sued them into paralysis. Congress takes the money away. So there's the political aspect of using what you already have. And then we do have some laws and policies that are just not up to date with what we're looking at. So, a very typical example of that is genetically engineered foods, right? So it's a new world. We're using old laws that didn't work so well in the first place, and they're now outmoded. So, so there's that piece of using what you have, but there is stuff that absolutely, in a rational universe would be updated. And then we also have just some bigger regulatory trends, right? We don't have a great regulatory system for looking at consequences that might be in somebody else's department, right? So if you plant this type of seed and you know that this type of seed is engineered to work with this particular weed killer, that's probably two different departments. Are they talking to each other? Do we have any ability to have a conversation about unintended consequences for the environment or for public health? So we kind of lack the ability of our regs to have a systemic purview. GMOs are just the current best example of the need for an overhaul. So actually this week was a comment period deadline for something called the Coordinated Framework of how the federal government, how different agencies are supposed to deal with biotech. So this is a memo that comes out of the White House saying various federal agencies have a job. How are they coordinating? They made a big grand announcement last summer, 2015, that they were going to update the Coordinated Framework because times had changed, the technologies had changed, and they put out an update, and it basically keeps the status quo, except they're going to talk more and they're going to communicate more, and we're using old laws. We never passed a new law for GMOs to say these are novel technologies. They're using existing authorities that they had for a new technology that's radically different, and stuff does fall between the cracks. I think a national food strategy would have to almost be a little bigger than food, right? So we have environmental laws that absolutely come into play. For example, a lot of our chemicals policy and chemicals laws have never worked. Really, TSCA's never really worked. And there's a food system piece of that. FIFRA, I think, is the same way. So I would have to be written pretty broadly, I think, and capture things that people might not think at first glance are food. But I think a food strategy is justified, and I think it would be, but I actually think it would be bigger than people think. And it would have more kind of tentacles than people think. And by itself, as a document on paper, it's not what we need. We need the political oomph behind it to get it passed and to actually use it. We all have thoughts about, like, if I was starting with a blank piece of paper, what laws would I write? What would the departments look like? Yeah, they would look different than what we have now. I don't know anybody that says this is the ideal system. But, this DC... You could wallpaper all the buildings in D.C. with white papers that have been written with good ideas and strategy documents, and without a plan to actually take them to the place where they become reality, and that is the political space where you have some power. You can't skip the grind of building up the political power to be able to change laws. And it's very hard to shortcut that, and even overnight issues that just came out of nowhere never come out of nowhere. It's just that people weren't watching the grind of building it up to that point. I don't want to be negative about the concept of a strategy or a big plan, but I also, the part about a plan in of itself is just a plan unless you have some power behind it is very real in our world. And there's been lots of attempts to have we're going to put together a big tent and we're going to figure it out and this is the time it's going to work. And sometimes parts of it have worked and sometimes they haven't, but often I think missing is that behind the scenes, long time work to actually build up a coalition that has power as opposed to a coalition that just has ideas. Passing some overarching fixes everything national food policy is a pretty long-term goal. So I think we're going to have to break it down into smaller steps. That might be local stuff, it might be state stuff, or it might be one particular policy at the national level. But by the time you've passed that, you've built the muscles to take on the next fight.